Welcome to Wider View, the program that provides perspectives on the news outside the narrow confines of the mainstream media. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. This broadcast represents something of a milestone for me. This is episode 100 of Wider View. I started this program in October 2016 as a radio show for community radio station WRFI in Ithaca and Watkins Glen, New York. Originally, the program aired bi-weekly, and here's my introduction from that first broadcast. This program will focus primarily on national and international news and opinion. While there are many mainstream and some alternative news media that cover this ground, many view events from the perspective of the U.S. government or the U.S. establishment, and both the facts they omit and present and their analysis reflect that perspective. Our intent is to provide a view outside the range of what is deemed politically acceptable. We believe it is vital to see ourselves as others see us and to present the facts and analyses that are omitted from the conventional narrative. The intent of the program hasn't changed over the last 3 years, but the format has. After a brief hiatus while moving west, I resumed the biweekly broadcast and added KEPW low-power community radio in Eugene, Oregon, my new home. I also began distributing the program, now a weekly show, through the Pacifica Network, and other affiliated stations began broadcasting the show. Podcasting began in November 2018 using podbean.com. Initially, Wider View consisted of my voice reading news and analysis from non-mainstream sources, often foreign press. It wasn't very good radio, and had it not been for the patience of non-commercial community radio stations, it probably would have been canceled early on. My first guest on the program was Don DeBar, the host of Community Progressive Radio News. He joined me on the fourth broadcast not long after the election of Donald Trump as president, and his initial comment underscores the need for programs like this one. I began by asking Don about the impact of the Trump election victory on the rest of the world.
You know, the shock and awe, I guess, that the electorate arose to, and I guess most people in the United States arose to on November 9th, was felt outside the territorial boundaries of the United States. It makes sense, of course, given the large footprint that the U.S. has had across the planet, certainly since 1945. Even really going back to the late 19th century. Of late, that footprint has been one that is less than benevolent, looking at some of the places where the U.S. decided to intervene, whether you want to look at Vietnam, Dominican Republic, and on a list of countries in Latin America, Africa, and Middle East and Asia. Since the so-called events of 9/11, the U.S. has been very actively involved in wars across the Middle East and in coups in a number of other places. And the strategy seems to have changed from the conventional imperial strategy that empires play, which is to try to control the political, economic, social, cultural activity in a country, to just negating countries as possible locus of the rise of an alternate structure, of an alternative to hegemony across the world.
But enough reminiscence. Since this program was created as an alternative to the mainstream media, I want to dedicate this episode to the bravest and most important journalist of recent years, Julian Assange, who is currently in Her Majesty's prison at Belmarsh in southeast London. As founder of WikiLeaks, Julian is responsible for publication of a number of documents that would have remained secret without his intervention. These include the Iraq war logs, including the famous collateral murder video showing U.S. troops killing 18 people, including Reuters journalists, from a helicopter in Iraq. He revealed the role of the United States in the brutal war against Yemen. He also published the leaked emails from the Democratic National Committee and the Clinton campaign that revealed their machinations to ensure that Bernie Sanders did not win the presidential nomination. Fearing prosecution by the United States for the crime of committing journalism, Julian Assange sought asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy in London in August 2012. He remained there 6.5 years until the new government of Ecuador, in exchange for U.S. aid, withdrew his asylum and allowed British police to enter the embassy and arrest him on April 11th of this year. On May 1st, 2019, he was sentenced to 50 weeks in prison in the United Kingdom for bail jumping. On the same day, the United States government unsealed an indictment against Assange for alleged computer intrusion related to the leaks provided by Chelsea Manning, who is also locked up at this point. On 23rd of May 2019, the United States government further charged Assange with violating the Espionage Act of 1917. On May 31st, Amy Goodman introduced UN Special Rapporteur on Torture Niels Melzer, who had just met with Assange in Belmarsh Prison.
The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture is warning that WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange is suffering from the effects of psychological torture due to his ongoing detention and threats of possible extradition to the United States. The UN expert, Niels Melzer, also warned Assange would likely face a politicized show trial if he were to be extradited to the United States. Melzer writes, quote, "In 20 years of work with victims of war, violence, and political persecution, I've never seen a group of democratic states ganging up to deliberately isolate, demonize, and abuse a single individual for such a long time." Melzer spoke to reporters this morning in Geneva, Switzerland.
And our finding was that Mr. Assange shows all the symptoms of a person who has been exposed to psychological torture for a prolonged period of time. So what we're speaking about is severe stress and constant stress, a chronic anxiety, severe psychological trauma. The psychiatrist that accompanied my mission said that his state of health was critical, and if he did not get urgent relief, that we would have to expect a rapid deterioration of that state of health, and possibly with irreparable harm.
Nothing has been done in the last 3 months to improve the situation of Julian Assange. Here is award-winning investigative reporter John Pilger speaking on RT News last week.
Julian's own condition is, how do I put it? It's very dangerous. When I last saw him about 10 days ago, I was shocked because he'd lost more weight. He was isolated. They seemed to be imposing a regime that must be punitive on him of isolation. He's in the health wing, what they call the healthcare wing, hospital wing of Belmarsh Prison, but he's in a single cell, and he told me that I see people walking by and I'd like to talk to them, but I can't. Category A prisoners, murderers, and others who've committed serious crimes are allowed to fraternize. Julian is not allowed to fraternize. He's not even allowed to telephone his American lawyers, and he's facing extradition to the United States. He had to wait 2.5 months to see an optician. And then when he got his glasses, one of the lenses didn't work. He's being denied the right to prepare his own defense. He's denied access to documents, access to the library, a laptop. His lawyer, his solicitor, Gareth Pearce, wrote to the governor of Belmarsh on the 4th of June about this and received no reply. What's going on? If there is no basic we understand if there is no basic justice in the treatment of somebody like this who is in prison because he infringed bail. That is just about the merest, it's not a crime actually, it is about the merest thing that the law can nail you for, and that is infringing your bail. He is there also, of course, because he's facing US extradition, but primarily he's there for this minor offense, and he's being treated in the way that political prisoners are treated all over the world. That's a moniker that won't be appreciated, but it applies.
What makes this situation even worse is that the mainstream media in the United States are saying nothing about it. If Russia had imprisoned a journalist and was holding him under these conditions, we would be hearing about it constantly. Lest you think this is simply the Trump administration going over the top once more, we have a leaked recording of Hillary Clinton suggesting that Julian Assange be killed with a drone, but the national security team convinced her it was a bad idea. But the case of Julian Assange is not an outlier. The press is dominated by establishment voices, government and corporate propaganda masquerading as objective journalism. Here's John Pilger again speaking about his book, Freedom Next Time.
Well, the title of this talk is Freedom Next Time, which, of course, is the title of the book. And the book is meant as an antidote to the propaganda that's so often disguised as journalism. And so I thought I would talk today about journalism, about war by journalism, propaganda and silence, and how that silence might be broken. Edward Bernays, the so-called father of public relations, wrote about an invisible government which is the true ruling power of our country. He was referring to journalism, the media. That was almost 80 years ago, not long after corporate journalism was invented. It's a history few journalists talk about or know about, and it began with the arrival of corporate advertising. As the new corporations began taking over the press, something called professional journalism was invented. To attract big advertisers, the new corporate press had to appear respectable, pillars of the establishment, objective, impartial, balanced. The first schools of journalism were set up, and a mythology of liberal neutrality was spun around the professional journalist. The right to freedom of expression was associated with the new media and with the great corporations, and the whole thing was, as Robert McChesney put it so well, entirely bogus. For what the public didn't know was that in order to be professional, journalists had to ensure that news and opinion were dominated by official sources, and that hasn't changed. Go through the New York Times on any day and check the sources of the main political stories, domestic and foreign. You'll find they're dominated by governments and other establishment interests. That's the essence of professional journalism. I'm not suggesting that independent journalism was or is excluded, but it's more likely to be an honorable exception. Think of the role Judith Miller played in the New York Times in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq. Yes, her work became a scandal, but only after it had played a powerful role in promoting an invasion based on lies. But Miller's parroting of official sources and vested interests was not all that different from the work of many famous Times reporters, such as the celebrated W.H. Lawrence, who helped cover up the true effects of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima in August 1945. "No radioactivity in Hiroshima ruin" was the headline on his report, and it was false. Consider how the power of this invisible government has grown. In 1983, the principal global media was owned by 50 corporations, most of them American. In 2002, this had fallen to just 9 corporations. Today, it's probably about 5. Rupert Murdoch has predicted that there will be just 3 global media giants, and his company will be one of them.
Many people had hoped that they could circumvent the establishment's control of most media by using social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. But here's whistleblower Vikram Kumar on the Jimmy Dore show recently talking about what's happening on social media in regard to news.
So I was a content specialist that helped promote videos on Facebook's newsfeed, and I was doing that through early this year, January through March. And then in spring 2018, I woke up one morning to see that all of your videos had gone dark. And by that, I mean that your videos were getting flagged on Facebook for political content. And the reason being is that you were acting a little too Russian for Facebook.
So how do you know that was the reason?
So back in 2017, there was that TechCrunch report that said that Facebook was taking measures to stop the spread of fake news by banning certain political accounts from promoting their videos on their newsfeed. So when I heard Mark Zuckerberg in 2018 telling Congress that he'd be doing the same thing, I thought, what changed between 2017 and 2018? Are they taking new measures? Are they retaking the measures? And it wasn't until a week later that I realized that Variety magazine reported that Facebook Watch, which is Facebook's media platform, had reached a multi-million-dollar deal with CNN, Fox News, ABC, and large media outlets.
No kidding.
So nothing about your content changed between 2017 and 2018, but the congressional testimony was the perfect opportunity for the political establishment, the media establishment, and the tech companies to form an alliance against small media outlets such as yourself.
Wow, that's very insightful, right? So what was the deal Facebook struck with those mainstream news outlets like CNN? What they had a deal to promote them, or what was the deal?
So, as you know, young people, they don't watch cable.
That's just correct.
News, yeah. And as you know,
but they watch this show.
Yes, they watch this show. And as you know, the viewership of Fox News, CNN, and ABC are dying off. They're getting older and older. And so what Facebook is it's access to young people, right? And so they viewed small anti-establishment media outlets such as yourself as an existential threat to their next generation of revenue.
Why would Facebook do that?
Because, tech companies view media companies extremely valuably. You go back to 1996, there was that merger between Microsoft, General Electric, and NBC to create MSNBC.com. A lot of people don't know that the MS in MSNBC stands for Microsoft. And the reason why media companies and tech companies are so intertwined with each other is because you can influence young people so much when you have the distribution network of something like Facebook. And with Facebook Watch and their media platform and that deal with CNN, Fox News, and ABC, they're able to indoctrinate the next generation of young people. And so they want to take viewership away from shows like yours and put those young people that haven't been paying attention to cable news back into the pockets of companies like Fox News, ABC, and CNN. And so Facebook is already taking steps to craft the political landscape in a framing that they find positively. And so you get that whole thing where Facebook shuts down over 800 political pages and accounts, and even legitimate political pages that expose things like police brutality. I know you pointed that out. And you're already seeing a coordinated effort from the establishment media and tech companies to kind of craft the narrative for young people.
So, again, I have said all along, as Matt Taibbi pointed out in his article about censorship from Facebook, is that the algorithms that Google does, YouTube does, Facebook does, the algorithms are all done in secret, which should already be a scandal. So the fact is they can do whatever they want. So I saw another fact or another statistic from Matt Taibbi was that 70% of people in America get their news from Google or Facebook. Meaning if you want to look up something, you Google it, and then whatever their algorithm is for stories, they decide what you get to see. Or you go to Facebook, same thing, and they're suppressing and deciding and pushing what stories they think you, just like you're saying, they're shaping the narrative for 2020 or 2019. They're deciding what is acceptable political thought and what isn't. And it turns out what's acceptable political thought is the establishment oligarchs' acceptable political thought, and people like us are being suppressed.
Yeah, and Facebook's narrative is whether you're part of the right or you're part of the left, if you're part of the anti-establishment, you're part of the problem.
Yes, if you're anti-establishment, you're part of the problem. If you're anti-war, anti-austerity, you're part of the problem, according to the mainstream media corporations and the big tech companies. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm proud to be part of that problem. But I know that access to a platform that will allow others to hear my anti-establishment message is very precarious at the moment. The mainstream media is completely closed to anti-establishment programming and even to anti-establishment voices on the programming they do air. Social media is increasingly hostile to anti-establishment voices as well. So what does this mean? It means fewer and fewer people are hearing anything that doesn't fit the establishment narrative. That's why fact-free narratives like Russiagate can get so much print space and airtime until even most progressives believe it. It's why stories like that of Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning get very little attention in the mainstream media. The man universally acclaimed as the world's greatest living public intellectual, Noam Chomsky, is never on the mainstream media in this country. But here's a little clip from an interview he did a few years back for German media.
The mainstream media are an ideological instrument. They have owners, they have commitments, they have advertising support, and so on. They're very valuable. I mean, I read them all the time. I'm glad they're there. But we shouldn't have any illusions. They're not coming from Mars. They are based on existing institutions of power and domination within our societies. And that affects the way what they choose to discuss at all, some things they don't discuss, and the ways in which they do it. It would be almost a miracle if that weren't true. And when they condemn actions like these, that should be taken as praise. Say we're doing the right thing. If these institutions condemn us, that's pretty good reason to think we're doing the right thing. It happens to be counter to their particular interests, but they don't represent the public interest. They represent certain special interests of power and domination and privilege. So if they don't like what we're doing, fine, let's continue. And it is the right thing to do, at least if you care about the survival of the species. And that's what's at stake. We should recognize that in the case of nuclear weapons, as well as environmental catastrophe, we're really talking about survival of the species. In the case of nuclear weapons, literal survival.
So with the mainstream media catering solely to corporate interests, where should we turn for news? More important still, how can we get alternative perspectives on the news seen and heard by people who don't already share our political views? Here are some examples of the way mainstream media misinforms. This one is by Tony Cartolucci in New Eastern Outlook. Quote, CBS in its article, Syrians trapped by Assad's ruthless Russian-backed barrage in Idlib beg for help, peddles an all-too-familiar narrative of helpless innocent civilians in desperate need of help. That help, of course, always comes in the form of U.S. intervention and the eventual total destruction of the nation, as was the case for Libya in 2011. The article claims that more than 3 million people are trapped under a Syrian bombing campaign as Bashar Assad battles to reclaim the last enclave held by rebels in his country. Idlib is the only remaining opposition stronghold after 8 grueling years of civil war. Well, there are no rebels or opposition in Idlib. There are, however, legions of militants operating under the banners of Al-Qaeda, the self-proclaimed Islamic State, and their various affiliates. These terrorists are the recipients of foreign arms and support. And many of them are not even themselves Syrian, making CBS's claim that Syria's conflict is a civil war wholly inaccurate. Like many of the West's narratives, CBS story depends on readers believing without any evidence that not only did their witness really exist and said what CBS claims they said, but really begged the U.S. to intervene despite seeing what U.S. interventions have done everywhere else in the region over the past 2 decades. Extra irony can be drawn from CBS reporting, considering that the U.S. itself has carried out airstrikes and drone attacks on Idlib over the years as well. End quote. I have a few criteria I use to determine whether a mainstream story is propaganda or not. First, if it concerns war or the threat of war or a justification for U.S. intervention in another country, I always suspect the story is at least misleading. The Syria story is a great example. When the U.S. bombs something, it's surgical strikes against terrorists, but Russian and Syrian attacks are brutal bombings of innocent civilians. Maybe not. Second, if the story concerns a nation that's a designated enemy of the U.S., it's highly suspect. Consider the ubiquitous coverage of the demonstrations in Hong Kong and the virtual silence about the Yellow Vest protests in France. The police repression in France is far worse than that in China, but China is a designated enemy. Listen to this report from Paris by Ramin Mazaheri of Press TV News.
For the 42nd consecutive weekend, Yellow Vest anti-government demonstrations were held in over 100 places nationwide. They have become France's first social movement to remain mobilized over the summer vacation season, which ends this weekend, showing the depth of their commitment and their discontent.
La France se réveille. France is waking up. The government continues to accuse all of us of being black bloc or thugs to make the country turn against us. But we are all united to prevent the destruction of France, and this unity will continue to increase.
A combative police force used tear gas in Paris, as they have at nearly every Yellow Vest demonstration for the past 9 months. The mass arrests and serious injuries have slowed recently, but the number of hurt, arrested, and imprisoned demonstrators dwarfs the recent far-right protests in Hong Kong and in Moscow. French and international media continue to almost completely ignore the Yellow Vests. Many believe that huge demonstrations are right around the corner, as French President Emmanuel Macron says he is starting Act 2 of his presidency by targeting the pension and unemployment systems. A new consensus appears to be emerging among the Yellow Vests to finally end their total independence. Macron has even more right-wing austerity rollbacks planned for September, which will cause unions to hit the streets in huge numbers, and many Yellow Vests say they are now willing to join other anti-government movements.
It's the unions who will be joining the Yellow Vests, because we have not been fighting just for one small group of workers, but for the entire country, the pensioners, the unemployed, the handicapped, the students, and everyone else. But we all want the same thing, to change not only this government, but also our capitalist system, which does not care for human beings.
The Eurozone, led by Germany, appears to be on the brink of a recession. French growth has totaled an anemic 0.5% this year, and yet is hailed in the mainstream media as a success. Many Yellow Vests say any shock to the global economy could set off an autumn of major discontent in France. Ramin Mazaheri, Press TV, Paris.
Change this capitalist system which does not care for human beings. That comment by a Yellow Vest protester makes it crystal clear why you aren't hearing about these protests very much on mainstream media. There really is fake news. It's not news reports that portray Trump in a bad light. It's news that serves corporate interests rather than the interest of the people. So this has been the 100th episode of Wider View. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. Thanks for listening.